here, and I think this will be a fascinating program. David Desimone always does wonderful programs, very informative, and so I think we'll learn something, and that's always a good thing, and have some fun listening. I turn it over to David. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Maureen, and it's always nice to be invited back to Janesville and to this lovely library to talk about local history, and in this case, we're going to talk about spiritualism in the Victorian era. But before we do that, I just want to explain how we even arrived at this topic in terms of research. So I work for the Wisconsin Historical Society, and I operate a site on Geneva Lake called Black Point Estate. And that is a Victorian summer home for a Chicago brewing family. And that family owns and occupies that house from 1888 through 2005. And there is no evidence that that family ever participated in spiritualism or seances, but we really like to delve deep into the Victorian era, mainly as a training mechanism for our tour guides, so they have a better understanding of the time period. And it's a fascinating time period. Of course, there's the Second Industrial Revolution, there's the Civil War, there's the rise of American cities, but from a cultural perspective, there's the rise of recreational time. There is more and more wealth being generated in this country. So there's a lot of avenues, if you're interested in that period, to sort of get an idea of what it was like to live in those years. So I started to research this program really in the winter of 2021. I picked up a book on the Fox sisters, and I'll talk about them in a moment. And then I eventually started to realize through my research that there's a really strong Wisconsin connection to the entire spiritualist movement of the 19th century. And so this program is going to start at a national level and then kind of laser into Wisconsin. And it's going to cover the time period roughly from the 1840s, like 1848, through the mid-1920s. And that kind of mirrors the birth, if you will, the rise, the height, and then the decline of the American spiritualism movement. So the program, Spiritualism in the Victorian Era, or as I like to call it, Calling All Spirits, really is going to look at that phenomenon. But before we jump into it, we're going to tell you what this program is not. This is not an endorsement nor condemnation of spiritualism. We'll get to that in a moment. This is not the telling of ghost stories. This is not black magic or engaging in occult practices, and this is not a seance. And the reason for those qualifiers is when we offer this program at Black Point, we're actually seated around the dining room table, and we kind of mimic a lot of the rules of engagement, if you will, for Victorian spiritualism, which would include seances. What this is really is a historical review of a very real 19th and early 20th century cultural phenomenon. And for our program today, a lot of the information is going to come out of spiritualist guides from that era. What we're looking at here is a screenshot of an 1861 book written by Uriah Clark. It's called A Plain Guide to Spiritualism. And if we were following Clark's guide to spiritualism, Clark would recommend that all the attendees today would sit in a circle. Ideally, we would have an equal number of male and female participants. That's to balance out the energy in the room. Male subjects would be seated on the speaker's left and female on the right. And when that's not possible, believers and non-believers would kind of take the appropriate position around the table. Lights would be turned completely off. If there were lights, if there were candles, those would be extinguished. Members would typically be asked to join hands to kind of create an energy circle. And now, if we were to do this in real time, that's kind of the configuration. But as I mentioned, since we're not recreating that, but there were a number of these various guides produced, 1860s, 1870s, right up through the early 1920s. But before we even jump into Wisconsin, we're going to start our topic off today with the Fox sisters. Has anybody heard of the Fox sisters?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, we've got a few folks. Another question is, does anybody in the room believe in ghosts?
Yes, I believe it.
All right. Does anybody here believe that we could communicate in one way, shape, or form? All right, well, it's kind of good to get a baseline, so thank you. So most histories of spiritualism start in Hydesville, New York. It's a small college town in upstate New York in 1848, when two adolescent sisters, Kate and Margaret Fox, and their photograph here is from, they're a little bit older, but it starts off with Kate and Margaret Fox, age at the time 10 and 14, are really going to be the catalyst for a movement that spreads very quickly across the United States. So we're back in 1848. How does it all begin? Well, these two young girls start to hear unexplained sounds in their home in Hydesville, New York. And it's reported, well, it's knocking. So their first communication, if you will, with a spirit is going to be in the sound of rappings. This goes on for a couple of weeks in the middle of March 1848, and Kate decides to challenge the entity to repeat the snaps of her fingers on March 31st of 1848. The presumed spirit does so and ends up rapping out the ages of the two girls. So this is apparently the first time that, so there's this repeated sound happening in their home for a couple of weeks. They're not sure, they can't explain it, so Kate decides maybe it's a spirit. Let's see if it's something that we could communicate with, and this is how this is really going to start. So that's in March of 1848. In early April, about 2 weeks later, the Fox sisters' parents decide to invite neighbors over to witness the event as well. This has been going on now about 3 or 4 weeks. I think they decide they want to bring in some additional adults to get a second opinion, if you will. Within a few days of this witness by neighbors, a very primitive code is developed, actually by Margaret and Kate's brother, so that they're going to be able to communicate with the spirit. And it's sort of, how many knocks on a wall are going to equal the letters of the alphabet. That's the early code. The two girls, through this call in response, they start off thinking, or they name their spirit Mr. Splitfoot. Does anyone know what the term Splitfoot or Mr. Splitfoot means in the Victorian era? It's slang term for the devil. So the two girls nickname their spirit Mr. Splitfoot, but however, due to the code that's devised, the rapping, they're able to identify that the spirit identifies himself as Charles B. Rosna, who was a 31-year-old peddler, a traveling merchant, if you will, who was murdered in their very house about 5 years earlier in 1843. The rappings reveal that Rosna's throat had been slit with a butcher knife in the east bedroom, and $500, which is a handsome sum of money in 1843, was taken from his body, and the body remains still in the Fox house in the cellar. So on Saturday night, April 11th, the Fox family begins to dig in the cellar. They discover a plank underneath some soil in their root cellar, and below that plank, they find charcoal, lime. And what would you need charcoal and lime for if you were digging a hole? Yes. You want to, mask odors, right? So it would help to, as tissue breaks down, it's going to become rather pungent, in that the charcoal and lime would help to remove that odor. They also find strands of human hair and a skull fragment. So that, according to the research, indicates that that's what the Fox family needs to confirm that the two daughters are actually really onto something. The two girls are soon entertaining large groups of the curious in their hometown of Hydesville. These groups typically are convening around the Fox family dining room table. Within a year, the two sisters, Margaret and Kate, are local celebrities, and under the urgings and guidance of their father, they're going to take their gift on the road to the next nearby largest town, and that's going to be Rochester, New York. Their father rents out the Corinthian Hall, Rochester's largest theater, for 3 nights, beginning on November 14th, 1849. 400 tickets, that's what the theater holds, 400 tickets are sold each night at 25 cents a ticket. To put this in perspective, the average weekly wage for a woman in 1849, for a working woman in 1849, was roughly 50 cents a week. So it would cost you half a week's salary to come to hear this 1-hour presentation. This demonstration was destined to be just the first of countless public seances, public spiritualist programs in which religious beliefs mingle with live entertainment, converting spiritualism not only into a religious practice, which it will become, but into a popular public attraction for several generations of Americans and British Victorians. The first few years of the Fox sisters' adventures as mediums really is going to serve as a virtual template for the spiritualist movement that would spring from it. 400 people are attending these programs in Rochester, and it's roughly estimated for most of their programs throughout their career, about half the people come out because they're believers, and the other half are coming out for the spectacle and hoping to see these two young ladies fail. Accounts of the ghostly events in Hydesville soon appear in the popular press. In the modern era, we talk about how quickly things could spread via social media. Trends could move all across the country in a matter of months. Many of us may remember a few years back the ice bucket challenge for ALS, where people were dumping buckets of ice water on themselves. That spread all over the country. Well, the story of the Fox sisters spreads all over the country, but there is, of course, no social media, there's no television, there's no radio, it's print press, and this starts to spread like wildfire. Within a couple of years of 1848, spiritualists and mediums and clairvoyant individuals start to show up everywhere, from St. Louis to St. Augustine to Los Angeles to Boston. Every community that has a community in the United States, somebody is deciding that they have a supernatural gift and they have the ability to communicate in one way, shape, or form with the dearly departed. Soon all over the country, Americans are forming their own spirit circles, reporting tales of ordinary citizens now spontaneously communicating with the deceased. What first is going to start off as a children's telling of ghost stories and later as an after-dinner entertainment quickly becomes a popular national phenomenon, but more importantly, a powerful new religion. It's estimated by the 1870s, this is 25 years after the Fox sisters first are communicating with their Mr. Splitfoot, that 4 million Americans identify as spiritualism as their religion of choice. To put that in perspective, the US population at the time is 40 million people. So that's 10% of all Americans in the 1870s are identifying as their religion of choice, if you will, is spiritualism. In the modern era, we will dismiss this behavior as sort of on the fringe. Put it in perspective, in the United States currently, it's estimated that there's 330 million, give or take. It's estimated that 8% of Americans identify as Jewish, and about 7% identify as Islamic, and we do not consider those religions fringe religions. We would never say you're way out on the fringe if you're of the Jewish faith or Islamic faith. So this is a big deal by the 1870s. This religion, yet, has no churches, no membership rolls, no formal governing body. That will happen a little bit later in the 1880s and 1890s. It does boast a very lively public circuit, and it's also practiced mainly in domestic settings, around tables, dimly lit. It really is coinciding with the rise in modern conveniences that are allowing people to have slightly larger homes, slightly more recreational time, and so you're building larger homes, you're not working from sun up till sundown, we're moving from agrarian to more of an industrial economy, more people are moving from rural to city living, so they're also looking for things to do to entertain each other in the evenings on a Friday or a Saturday night, and board games are starting to be invented. There are card games, there's of course music and conversation and books, but this is one of those things where it becomes a social activity as much as a religious practice. Now back to the Fox sisters, their demise was almost as swift as their rise. Both Margaret and Kate have very troubled personal lives. Some might argue that what started off as this knocking in their bedroom in 1848, and then they become sort of darlings of the lecture circuit. Some may argue that their father is the first to exploit them because the money is usually staying with the father. Both Margaret and Kate have multiple marriages. Often what happens is they're marrying a gentleman that will continue to have them lecture an awful lot, like 6-7 times a week, generating thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars. And unfortunately, when they are divorced multiple times, where do you think the money stays? Stays with the husband. Both Margaret and Kate also have problems with substance abuse, alcohol, opioids. They endure economic hardship over and over again. Any fortunes they amass tend to, like I said, stay with their ex-husbands. In the end, both Fox sisters renounce spiritualism as a fraud. Maggie is the most outspoken about this phenomenon being a fraud, a phenomenon that they had basically started. In her greatest condemnation for it as a fraud, during a public speech at the Academy of Music in New York on October 21st, 1887, so roughly 40 years, she announces, and this is a direct quote, "I am here tonight as one of the founders of spiritualism to denounce it as an absolute falsehood from beginning to end, as the flimsiest of superstitions, the most wicked blasphemy known to the world." So in other words, she's claiming that Kate and herself just made it up. What do you think that's going to have as an impact on the spiritualist movement, which is now approaching its 40th year? Absolutely right. It doesn't do anything to stop the movement. So that is where we start on the national level. But since I work for the Wisconsin Historical Society, we're going to jump into Wisconsin, and we're going to talk about Cora Scott and Mary Folsom. By a show of hands, have any of you heard of either of these two women? Yes. Fantastic. Well, this is Cora Scott, this flouncy-looking Victorian woman. I love the curls in her hair and the dress. And then this is Mary Folsom. We're going to talk about their story. We're going to start with Cora. So Cora's development as a medium begins in 1851 when she was just 11 years old, living with her family in Waterloo, Wisconsin. Cora, however, is not born in Wisconsin. She's born in Allegheny County, New York, not too far from where the Fox sisters are residing. She's about the same age as the youngest Fox sister. While in Wisconsin, according to the research, as the story goes, Cora is assigned schoolwork. She has to write a composition for school. This is before notebooks. She has slates, so she has a slate tablet. Apparently, she decides to go out to the family's backyard in Waterloo, Wisconsin, to work on her schoolwork. She falls asleep. And when she awakes from her slumbers, she finds the slate covered with writing not her own. Cora brings the slate inside to her mother to read. Her mother reads the communication and finds it to be addressed to her, meaning Cora's mother, and it's from a sister who had been in the spirit world for some years. A sister that Cora had no prior knowledge of. So the sister had died before either Cora was born or old enough to be aware of it, and the mother had never told Cora about it, so there's a communication from Cora's aunt through this slate in Cora's handwriting. So throughout the entire movement, by the way, with spiritualism, there's this sort of, it's like an arms race, if you will. There's knocking and rapping, and then the next wave of mediums, it's channeling through writing or through audible communication. And then it's going to be the ability to float furniture and the ability to heal people. And then it's going to eventually become ectoplasm. And so there's these, with each iteration, it becomes a little bit more outlandish. So we're going to jump from table rapping in the first iteration of spiritualism as the communication to now actually being able to communicate with spirits and write out what they're saying, or in some cases, to audibly communicate. So Cora becomes what is known as a trance medium. This means she's going to go into a deep trance and be directed by spirit guidance. And many of these trance mediums will have a spirit, a guiding spirit that's the same over and over again. Sometimes these trance mediums will have multiple guides leading them through their communication with the departed. So this, in a way, is an advance over the Fox Sisters form of rapping. Cora will also then eventually, her gift will be developed so she can not only write for spirits, but she could audibly communicate for spirits. Now, she is the most famous spiritualist of the 1860s and early 1870s. She moves from Waterloo, Wisconsin to Brooklyn as a young lady. And then in 1863, so she's about 24 years old, she moves to Washington, D.C. What is going on in the U.S. history in the 1860s?
Civil War.
Civil War. So believe it or not, Cora Scott is actively sought out for advice by who do you think? Pretty important person. Abraham Lincoln, as well as members of his cabinet. It's reported that Cora Scott actually had a meeting with Abraham Lincoln a couple of weeks before he was assassinated. Ulysses S. Grant continues to ask Cora Scott for advice and guidance during his first term as president. Grant would later honor Cora with a resolution of gratitude from the President of the United States for her 6 years of service during the nation's most difficult time. So let's think about this in the modern era. If we would have had a sitting president in the last, say, 20 years that was making decisions on national policy under the influence of a medium or a spiritualist advisor, how would we feel about that? Would we kind of raise our eyebrows? I see somebody in the back doing this. But this kind of shows how big spiritualism is and how widely accepted it is in the time period.
Didn't we have a president where his wife?
Yes, we did.
Ronald Reagan.
Yes, I was
Ronald
just
Reagan.
about to say it. I think
Right.
it was Ronald Reagan.
Right. Yeah.
And that's what I was wondering, was it Mary Lincoln who
So both.
originally brought her to her husband?
So I don't know who connected the dots, but both actually would receive guidance from Cora. Absolutely right. And we're going to get to Mary in a little bit. I'm glad you brought that up. So Cora is really a big deal in the 1860s, so much so that her reputation attracts the spiritualist in England, and they ask her to come over to England for a 6-month visit, and she agrees. She arrives in England in the spring of 1873, but she ends up staying for 2 full years while she's there. She's in such high demand that in the 2 years she is in England, she gives more than 3,000 lectures. Now think about that. If you do the math, there's 700 days in 2 calendar years. That means this young lady is giving on average 3 lectures a day for 2 full years. She's making a considerably large sum of money because none of these programs are, well, I shouldn't say none, the majority are not free. There's an admission to this. She comes back to the United States in 1875 and becomes the pastor of the first Spiritualist Society, which is located in Chicago. And during her role as the first pastor of the society, she goes on to give another 2,500 performances. Now, Cora, just like the Fox sisters, has a very troubled personal life. She is plagued with a number of exploitive marriages. She is jilted a number of times. She is left broke when her husbands depart. And she also struggles with substance abuse and personal strife. She dies in relative obscurity in 1923. So right out of the gate, it's not looking too good for our spiritualists in terms of benefiting from the gift that they claim to have. That's going to change with Mary Folsom. Mary is a school teacher. She's a little bit older than Cora when her gift comes to her, a little bit older than the Fox sisters. Mary, like I said, is an adult school teacher, but ends her career as a teacher when she receives the powerful gift of healing through spiritual insight. So her ability is not to channel spirits, not to communicate with them, but she claims she could look through a person almost with like X-ray vision, identify an ailment, and through her spiritualist gift have the ability to heal those individuals. Over Mary's lifetime, more than 7,000 people claim that she has helped them with medical ailments, that she has helped to heal those people. How does she provide medical guidance when she is not a doctor? Well, she uses this sort of X-ray vision to pinpoint medical issues, and her healing techniques include herbal treatments, water treatments, dietary restrictions, including abstaining from alcohol, coffee, tea, and tobacco. Well, there's some logic to that. If you have a respiratory problem and she says quit smoking, or you have a stomach problem, quit drinking whiskey, there might be some easy solutions there. But she's also going to heal you with faith and good old-fashioned optimism. There's also some truth to that, right? You hear that when people have long-term illnesses, they say your outlook really has a big role in how well you're able to recover. To sort of highlight that Cora and Mary and the Fox sisters are running in some pretty educated and sophisticated circles, some of Mary's clients, if you will, or patients, include a U.S. Senator, Wisconsin Supreme Court Justice, and the superintendent of the Wisconsin Historical Society. So once again, this isn't folks on the fringe of society. These are folks that are in some really key positions. In 1883, Mary, her gift evolves from spiritual healing to she's now able to predict the future. She predicts there's going to be a boom in mining in Wisconsin, and encourages her 2 adult sons to dig in an area 40 miles from Ashland, Wisconsin. She is predicting that this area is going to be significant for iron ore deposits. And guess what? Mary is correct. Her family, her two sons, identify and discover 2 mines in this area. It yields one of the richest iron ore ranges ever to be discovered in the Midwest. Her 2 sons form the Germania mine and the Ashland mine, ultimately building the town of Harley, Wisconsin to provide housing and stores and churches for the folks that are needed to work in these mines. The Folsom family generates significant wealth through Mary's vision. And like many folks from upstate Wisconsin, when the things are going well for them, they move south. They decide actually they're going to move all the way to San Jose, California. Get out of that cold Lake Superior weather and end up on the sunny shore, or sunny coast, if you will, or close to the coast of California. Now, while they build in San Jose, they build a 64-room mansion, and they name the surrounding area Edenvale. First mansion builds down in 1899. They build a new, larger one, which still stands today. Adjacent, or within about a mile of the Folsom estate, is the Sarah Winchester estate. Is anybody familiar or have heard about the Sarah Winchester estate? Right. The Winchester estate is called the Winchester Mystery House. Not part of our Wisconsin story, but if you're familiar with it, you already know. If you're not, I'll give you a quick overview. The story goes with Sarah Winchester. She inherits the Winchester rifle fortune. And according to the Winchester lore, if you will, Sarah is sort of convinced that the people who have been harmed by her father's invention of this repeating rifle, those spirits might be coming to plague her. And she's also convinced that if she continues to build the house, it's never finished, that will help keep the spirits at bay. And then also every room should have multiple doors in it. Some rooms have as many as 6 to 8 doors. These two women, Sarah Winchester and Mary Folsom, are really, if you will, neighbors. We don't have any direct research that indicates that they've spent time together, but you could imagine if you're both very, very wealthy, both living within a general area of each other, and both have similar interests, there might be some overlap. So we're going to continue to try to connect those dots. But back to Mary's place, the family owned over 700 acres, which would become really prime real estate in Silicon Valley. Talk about striking it rich twice. Much of their acreage was planted with fruit trees and for general farming. A considerable portion of the land is now the Edenvale Garden Park, which is owned by the city of San Jose, and the house can be used as an event center, a wedding venue. Mary dies in 1905, and unlike the Fox sisters, she dies very, very happy and very, very wealthy. Right up the road from us, actually kind of adjacent to us, we are in Whitewater. This is the Morris Pratt Institute. Morris Pratt is a successful businessman, farmer, landowner from Whitewater, and he, in his lifetime, witnesses public demonstrations by Cora Scott and Mary Folsom, and he becomes very rapidly, he becomes an ardent supporter of spiritualism. Pratt decides in 1889 to purchase the lot in Whitewater and to open the Temple of Science, a building dedicated to spiritualism. Regular spiritualist meetings are held here in one of the 2 twin halls, and they attract a substantial crowd of local spiritualists. The Wisconsin State Association of Spiritualists will hold their quarterly meetings in Whitewater for a number of years. As Pratt ages and his health is starting to decline, in 1901 he offers to give this building, his spiritualist temple, to the National Spiritualist Association so it could be used as a spiritualist college. The NSA refused the gift. They're not interested in moving to a smaller community, and they feel that this would not be a good home for them. Pratt, nevertheless, not to be discouraged, nevertheless forges ahead and files a petition with the state of Wisconsin to incorporate his own school. What do you think the state does? What do you think their response is? They approve it. They actually accredit the Morris Pratt Institute. For a number of years, you could get a 2-year degree from the Morris Pratt Institute on spiritualism. The school opens in September 30th, 1902. In the first year, it's a 2-year degree. In the first year, students are taught traditional academic subjects, biology, math, history, English. Those classes are reported to take place on the second level. The first level is administrative offices. The third level is for second-year students, and this third level is to remain restricted to instructors and those second-year students. In this large room, the entire room is from floor to ceiling, painted and furnished entirely in white. So the floors are painted white, the walls are white, the ceiling's white, the window trim is white, all the furnishings are white. And the students and the staff that are on that third floor for their educational purposes are going to be dressed in all white. This is not a Ku Klux Klan outfit. This is actually a spiritualist outfit in the Wisconsin Historical Society collection. And so those second-year students would have been dressed in an outfit very similar to this. And while they're going to have classes on channeling spirits, crystal ball gazing. There would have been ritual and dogma, a lot of things where it was like a repetition where you would almost get into a trance-like state. That's going to be your second year classes. The Institute reaches its peak in enrollment in 1910 with 45 students. 1915, enrollment is going to start to decline. What happens in the United States in 1917? War. We enter World War I. There are going to be a lot of young people being called up. Enrollment continues to decline shortly after the war. And then in the early 1920s, I forgot to mention, in 1902, Pratt dies, but he leaves an endowment, a very large endowment. So the school's going to continue to function. So in the 1920s, there's discussion on moving the school from Whitewater to Chicago. The thought was larger population base might be a little bit easier to attract additional students. They thought enrollment would go up. They decided to stay in Whitewater, to not abandon their home there. In the 1930s, enrollment is continuing to decline. And then in the mid-30s, like many people who have investments, the endowment gets wiped out more or less as the stock market continues to crash. So now a school that has about 20 students and no endowment, it's going to be hard to keep the lights on. The school's final semester in Whitewater is May of 1939. In 1942, the thought is let's convert this beautiful Second Empire building to a retirement home for older American spiritualists. This is short-lived. It's probably not going to be a lot of people out there that would fit the bill. In 1946, a new Morris Pratt Institute opens in Milwaukee, and believe it or not, there is still a Morris Pratt Institute where you can go and get a degree on spiritualism. It's no longer accredited by the state of Wisconsin, but it is in Wauwatosa. So you can get that. So what happens to this beautiful building? You're absolutely right, it is there. So what happens to this beautiful building? Well, it gets converted to a girls' dormitory in 1948. And then over the next decade, it's reported that by many of the young ladies who are living there, it's not the best place to be to use as a dormitory because they report stories of knockings, ghost sightings. Can you imagine a group of 20-year-olds away from home, maybe for the first time, living in what used to be referred to in Whitewater as the Spook Temple? So the building is finally demolished in 1958. Now, we don't have a lot of information on Leafy Anderson, but I'm going to continue to research her. When spiritualism is developing in the 1860s and 1850s. It's sort of like Jesse Jackson's Rainbow Coalition. Everybody is welcome. But by the 1900s, it's becoming, like many institutions, very, very segregated, and you have to sort of fit a certain profile. Leafy Anderson, who is an African American, wants to join the Wisconsin Spiritualist Association. She could kind of be a member at large, but she has bigger ideas and really has a lot of desire to kind of forward the movement, and she's really not welcome into the group. So she decides, fine, I'm going to to develop my own organization, and she forms the Eternal Life Christian Spiritualist Association here in Wisconsin. And then she relocates to New Orleans. And while she's in New Orleans, she sets up her first spiritualist church, the Church of Eternal Life. And the church is borrowing from spiritualist practices, from Southern Baptist church practices, as well as New Orleans voodoo. And the church quickly grows and spreads throughout the Deep South. Many of these black spiritualist churches that are based upon Leafy's teachings are still in existence in the 21st century. What we do know is Madam Anderson dies in 1927, so I think there's more to the story, and since there's a Wisconsin connection, I wanted to include her. Now, William Mumler is not from Wisconsin, but he would have been a contemporary of a very famous Wisconsin photographer by the name of H.H. Bennett. Bennett is in the Wisconsin Dells. He's a very prominent landscape photographer, Native American photographer. He would have, Civil War photographer, he would have definitely known either Mumler by reputation or personally. So part of spiritualism's ability to attract new followers, as I mentioned, is like every so often there's a new trick, if you will. The movement has gone from spirit rappings to trance mediums to spirit writings to levitations and ectoplasm. One of the biggest sensations really is spirit photography, though. Photography in this era is really often associated with magic, especially for folks with a very low level of education. They tend to be superstitious. They haven't had their photograph taken in the 1850s. 1860s is becoming more and more common. And at least metaphorically, for many people, the first experience with photography, they feel it is magical, maybe even more magical than conjuring a spirit, because it involves chemicals, it involves a darkroom and hoods, and how are you taking my photograph and putting it on this piece of metal or piece of glass? So Mumler is considered the first and without question the best known spirit photographer. Now in the modern era, what we're looking at here is the photographer with what he is claiming is a photograph of a ghost. This seems really basic to us in the 21st century because we could all do this on our phone in a couple clicks of a button. But this is not that easy, or so people think, in the 1860s. We don't have Photoshop. We don't understand how, for most people, how photography really even works. So Mumler announces in 1861 that he has made a successful photograph of a spirit. But even more importantly, he could duplicate it on demand. What's going on again in the 1860s? Civil War. What that means for many people is father, son, brother is being called up or joining and being killed on a battlefield 5, 6, 8, 900, 1,000 miles away from home and being buried there. So maybe father, brother, uncle photograph didn't exist yet because they just didn't get around, because it's not accessible or easy to do necessarily, especially in smaller towns. So if you want a memento or a memory of your dearly departed, you could track down somebody like Mumler and get a photograph of your dearly departed loved one with you or maybe by themselves. Lucky for Mumler, his wife, Hannah, is also a clairvoyant medium, so she could help communicate with the departed, and William could take the photograph. So not only does this open up the mumblers to the spirit world, but it also opens him up to the capitalist market. Mumbler is going to charge handsomely for a spirit photograph. How much do you think he's going to charge a Civil War widow to get a photograph of her deceased husband? Not deceased, actually, but the ghost. It's the 1860s. What would you think somebody would pay for this?
$5.
How much?
$5.
$5, $1. It's actually going to be $10.
Wow.
To put it in perspective, that's roughly a week's salary for a working class man. So would any of us pay an entire week's salary for one photograph in 2023?
Yes.
We have one person that says yes. So in 1869, Mumbler is arrested on charges of 2 felonies and 1 misdemeanor by the New York District Court. He's a New York City resident. And those charges include public fraud, larceny, obtaining money under false pretenses, and exploitation. The court brings in other photographers into the courtroom with their dark rooms set up, and they are going to walk the jury exactly through the process of how this is done. This is a double exposure. There's nothing more to it. This is a photograph, and then so he would take a photograph and then go into the darkroom, take a plate that has an existing photograph, put it over top, hit the enlarger, or in this case, if it wasn't an enlarger, you're pouring chemical over a plate. And then the second image, and you can manipulate it while the chemical's wet. You could kind of rub it or smudge it. There's a lot of ways to soften the image, and you're going to get a double exposure. So the jig is up. The evidence against Mumbler is right there in front of the jury. How do you think the jury decides?
Not guilty.
Not guilty. Not guilty. Despite the overwhelming evidence, the jury refuses to convict him. Mumbler continues to advance photography outside of spirit photography, but he continues to do this spirit photography for another 15 years until his death in 1884. When asked about it, Mumbler kind of brushes it off as saying, well, many people just want to believe. Some of his cabinet cards here, they're hard to see, but there's definitely a ghost in all of these. And Maureen, do you know who this woman is?
No.
That's Mary Todd Lincoln.
Oh.
Right. This photograph is Mumbler's most famous photograph. It is Abe, photograph behind him. It's really blurry from where you're at, but it's definitely Abe. And Abe's got his hands. So Mary Todd, if you may know this, she kind of spirals into mental illness. One of her sons dies young, another son dies. Abe, of course, is assassinated. This is taken after Abraham Lincoln is assassinated, obviously. And she becomes institutionalized for a number of years. So she has a real tragic tale. I would imagine that she would have, sought out Mumbler to try to have some peace in her life. I'm sure he charged her, and I'm sure this photograph became one of the more famous. If you ever were to come across any of these spirit photographs in an antique shop, just from a pure investment standpoint, buy them, because there are a large number of collectors out there. All right. Harry Houdini and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Houdini is not a Wisconsin native, but he does consider Appleton his home. He lives in Appleton for a number of years. Whenever he's asked where he's from, he says from Appleton. It's actually, Houdini spends a little bit of time in Walworth County as a young man. He was working on a family farm, or maybe extended family. So in the 1920s, Houdini turns from escape artist to unmasking and lecturing on fraudulent mediums. The reason he's doing this is he is the master escape artist, right? He could get out of straitjackets, tanks of water, chains. That requires a lot of dexterity, the ability to hold your breath for large periods of time. He's getting older. He needs to diversify his act so he can continue to go on the lecture circuit. He claims, as the master of illusion, he is the most qualified person in the United States to expose fraudulent mediums who are capable of fooling academics and scientists. Nobody will be able to spot a fraud, in Houdini's estimation, better than Houdini himself, because he knows the tricks of the trades. He's also driven by the fact that Houdini does not believe humans possess a soul. He feels that when brain activity ceases, a person is completely dead. He does not believe in any type of afterlife. He believes that all supernatural phenomena are either caused by tricks or delusions. And so as he goes around the country in the early 1920s, debunking psychics, mediums, and those with clairvoyant abilities, he brings incognito with him a reporter and a police officer, and at the opportune moment, Houdini will expose himself, kind of jump out and say, aha, and he'll prove how the trick was rendered. Photographer and reporter will write it up, and police officer will arrest the medium. He actually does this a number of times. There's a phenomenal book called The Witch of Lime Street, which I highly recommend, that deals with a very true story in New York in the 1920s. So he's actually America's #1 Ghostbuster in the 1920s, if you will. He becomes a member of the Scientific America Committee. This committee offers a substantial cash reward to any medium who could successfully pass any of the tests of the committee's choosing to prove that they actually do have supernatural abilities. To this day, nobody's ever claimed the prize. Now, where does Sir Arthur Conan Doyle come in? Well, in many respects, the two men represent flip sides of the spiritualist debate. Houdini, who is the legendary magician and master of illusion, master of escape, he then, I mentioned, goes on to become the leading person to expose spiritualism. Doyle, on the other hand, starts off as a doubting man of reason. He attends a seance in the 1880s, 1887 actually, sort of as a way to prove that these don't really exist or work, but he becomes a believer through that experience. And then he has a son that's killed in World War I, and he communicates through a clairvoyant medium with his son. So he is, by the 1920s, a firm believer in spiritualism. He actually writes an entire book on the topic. So these two men at polar opposites. The first meeting in 1920 is relatively friendly. 1922, Doyle comes to the US to lead a lecture on spiritualism, and he meets Houdini in Houdini's house in Harlem, and the two men actually bond over their collection of rare books. Fast forward to June of 1922, Houdini and Harry's wife Bess are invited to the Ambassador Hotel in Atlantic City by the Doyles, where Mrs. Doyle, Lady Doyle, will hold a seance, and the Houdinis will attend. At the seance, Lady Doyle will soon, and she's channeling through writing. That's her gift. She channels Harry Houdini's mother. And she is writing out information, messages from Harry Houdini's mother that are supposed to be for Harry. Doyle writes of the afternoon, and this is a direct quote, "It was a singular scene. My wife, with her hand flying wildly, beating the table while she scribbled at a furious rate. I, sitting opposite, tearing sheet after sheet from the blocks as it was filled up, and tossing each across to Houdini, while he sat silent, looking grimmer and paler every moment. Messages from his mother." Houdini privately wondered why his mother, who spoke no English and was of Jewish faith, had returned from the grave only after Lady Doyle had made signs of the Catholic cross and was communicating in English. On October 30th of the same year, the New York Sun interviews Harry Houdini about the event, and Houdini publicly blasts the Doyles as frauds. These are two very, very large celebrities of this era, and so it becomes sort of a nasty public feud. Obviously, the friendship between the Doyles and the Houdinis was over at that point. Now, we're going to jump ahead to 1926. Houdini is starting to have premonitions, so many that he's starting to tell friends he is convinced he is going to die at the hands of an angry medium, somebody that he's exposed as a fraud. He's made a lot of enemies. However, that's not how he dies. He dies on October 31st, Halloween night, of peritonitis. How does that happen? Well, a few days earlier, more than likely a few days earlier, a young, very physically fit man comes backstage to one of Houdini's performances and challenges the former strongman to a strength competition. And basically, Houdini allows the young man to punch him in the stomach to test how strong he is. When that punch is delivered, internal organs are damaged, gallbladder, appendix, not exactly certain, but he dies from internal wounds from that. And that's what's tragic about that on a couple of levels is, one, this was a punch that he invited, but also that's very easily treatable in the modern era. But at the time, due to imaging and medical diagnosis, it was not as easy to determine what it was. As Harry lays dying, he turns to his wife, Bess. Now remember, he doesn't believe in an afterlife. But he does decide, or he communicates to his wife as he's dying on Halloween night, he's going to give her a code that she would recognize as proof that her late husband had contacted her from beyond the grave. And the code is going to be Rosabelle Believe. After all, if anybody could escape the shackles of death, it's going to be the greatest escape artist to have ever lived. So what do you think Bess does, his wife? She actually does have the seance. She's going to have the seance for the next 10 years. And if my technology works, we're going to see here. This is Bess and a medium on the roof of the Knickerbocker Hotel, where that seance is held for 10 years. And let's see, I have it saved here. Now I feel bad for the folks maybe online, they might not be able to hear it, but this is on YouTube. Absolutely love the internet for this type of thing.
O thou disembodied spirits, those of you that have grown old in the mysterious laws of spirit land, we greet thee. We have gathered here at the appointed time. We have complied with all the requirements to enable all of you to make your presence known. Members of the spirit world have long known of the intention of this important gathering tonight. All is in readiness. Please now, the time is at hand. Make yourself known to us. Any of you, please, manifest yourself in any way possible. Please let your united strength and knowledge aid Houdini in coming through. It is the spirit of Houdini we wish to contact. Houdini, are you here? Are you here, Houdini? Please manifest yourself in any way possible. Take from this earnest gathering any strength that may be necessary for you to use. Take any vital thing from us that you may need to enable you to carry out your promise of years ago. We have waited, Houdini, oh so long. Never have you been able to present the evidence you promised. And now, this is a night of nights. The world is listening. Harry, your world, your audience. And Bessie is here. Your Bessie, who was part of you for 33 years. She's here, Harry, pleading in her heart for a prearranged sign from you.
And it'll go on for another 10, 15 minutes. Do you think Harry shows up? Poor Bess. Harry never connects with her. So Bess she's done holding the seance in 1936. However, Harry has a brother, Hardeen. Hardeen continues to hold the seance for a number of years, and Hardeen has a partner, or protege, and his protege's name is Sid Radner. Sid continues to hold the seance every Halloween night until 2011. Harry, at that point, still has not come back. When Sid passes away, the tradition is continued by Sid's son, Bill. In 2012, Bill decides to open the seance up to the public. He moves the entire outfit to Vegas, and now you can purchase a ticket to the Harry Houdini seance on Halloween night for a very handsome fee. Full circle back to the Corinthian Hall when the Fox family, or Mr. Fox, decides to charge 25 cents a ticket. There's a very commercial component to this. So, and here's an image of the seance during a more recent period for Harry Houdini. So, in the 170 years since two teenage girls started a religion with the practical joke, thousands of mediums have held seances attended by millions. Spiritualists have been consulted, studied, questioned, photographed, recorded, and measured. True believers have gathered and celebrated. Churches have been formed. Organizations and towns christened, and are all in pursuit of a few words of comfort from deceased loved ones. And yet, with all of that, not a single verifiable shred of scientific evidence has ever been obtained to confirm the existence of spirits or the ability to communicate with them. Skeptics have revealed the fraud behind the miracle, the gross imposture of the mediums, and the gullibility of the faithful. For everyone who has ever exclaimed, "I have seen," there have been debunkers pulling back the curtain to display the trickery. Yet millions and millions of people still ask, is there anybody out there? In many ways, it's a faith-based kind of belief. There's no way to prove it or disprove it. You either feel it or you don't. So that kind of takes a high-level view of spiritualism from its very founding through a Wisconsin lens, and then it does sort of dissipate after the 1920s, and it's still around, but it's much smaller than when it was, upwards of 10% of Americans. So it does still exist. There are spiritualists and mediums and clairvoyant individuals in every community. Some people believe, some people say it's complete nonsense, and there's a lot of people in between. And well, so thank you all again, really appreciate it. And thanks to Maureen for having us. We love coming here. It's a great facility.
Love having you. It's always interesting. So thank you all for coming. Join us again.
Thank you.
Thank you.